talent I borrowed and never returned.
Nate Garrison had spent years chasing a dream that refused to catch him. His bandmates used to call him obsessive. "You don't want to make music," his drummer once said. "You want to be music, but it'll devour you before you get there."
They were right. At 30, Nate stood alone, his once promising career reduced to rejection emails and empty bar gigs. His songs were good, but good wasn't enough. One rainy night, trudging home after yet another failed gig, he heard it. The melody drifted through the damp air, faint yet arresting. It wasn't just beautiful, it was alive, each note charged with an aching, raw power. Nate followed the sound into an alley where shadows pooled unnaturally. At the center of the darkness sat a man on a milk crate. His wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, and his guitar, battered and patched with duct tape, seemed to hum with a resonance that shouldn't have been possible. The song was called Borrowed Light. Nate didn't know how he knew this. Perhaps the performer murmured it, or maybe the melody itself whispered its name. I was born in shadow, shaped by the flame, borrowed light to guide me, but I burn just the same. What glows will fade, what's taken, lost. Borrowed light demands its cost. The words carved themselves into Nate's mind. The melody settled in his chest like a haunting, pulsing with an unspoken truth. When the final note faded, Nate spoke, his voice trembling. That was incredible. Where did you learn it? The performer tilted his head slightly. It's not learned, he rasped. It finds you. You could be playing to thousands, Nate said. Why stay here? The man chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves scraping pavement. I thought I could control it once too. Now it controls me. Nate frowned. What do you mean? The man's faint smile didn't reach his eyes. Songs like this aren't born. They're forged. Every note carries someone's pain. You can't take it without paying the price. The melody followed Nate home, looping endlessly in his mind. That night, he dreamed of a vast stage, playing Borrowed Light to a roaring crowd. But the audience was wrong. Faceless shadows with glowing eyes stared at him, their voices rising in an eerie, warped harmony. Borrowed light demands its cost. The shadows surged toward him, and he woke gasping, drenched in sweat. For days, Nate wrestled with his conscience. He returned to the alley, watching the performer from the shadows. The man played Borrowed Light every night, as though it were the only song he knew. He doesn't even want it, Nate told himself. I'm saving it from dying in this alley. Still, when he finally brought a recorder, his hands shook. As the performer played, Nate felt a cold dread settle over him. For a moment, he hesitated, the man's words echoing in his mind. But then the melody tightened its grip. He pressed record. Borrowed Light changed everything. Critics called it a masterpiece that transcends time. Fans packed venues, screaming the lyrics, some weeping uncontrollably during performances. But the song's power was not without consequence. At one concert, a fan collapsed, his eyes unfocused. It's like I was inside the song, he muttered. It showed me things I buried. Online forums buzzed with stories of listeners haunted by the song. Some claimed to hear it even when it wasn't playing. Others described glowing eyes watching them in the dark, or dreams where the melody pulled them into endless shadows. One fan approached Nate after a show, trembling. It's not just a song, she whispered. It's alive. It sees me. Nate dismissed the stories as hysteria. Still, the unease lingered. Despite the growing sense of dread, Nate reveled in his success. Standing under the blinding stage lights, with thousands chanting his lyrics, he thought, "I've made it." For the first time, he felt whole. But the dreams returned, darker and more vivid. In one, he found himself back in the alley. The performer stood over him, playing a warped version of Borrowed Light. The melody twisted the world into a surreal nightmare, the shadows whispering incomprehensible words. "What glows will fade," the performer said, his eyes glowing faintly beneath the brim of his hat. "What's taken, lost." The first time Nate's voice cracked, he brushed it off. But within weeks, he could barely sing. During a televised performance, his voice gave out entirely, leaving him gasping on stage. His crew abandoned him. His fans turned on him, calling him a fraud. Desperate, Nate returned to the alley. The performer was waiting, his guitar humming softly in the darkness. "You took what wasn't yours," the man said. "I gave it life," Nate rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The world loves it because of me." The performer's faint smile returned, and now it demands payment. The melody of Borrowed Light twisted into a jagged, dissonant wail. The shadows writhed, stretching toward Nate like living things. The performer's hands were no longer hands. They were claws, blackened and sharp. They plunged into Nate's chest, and he felt himself unravel. His voice, his memories, his very essence, all torn away, note by note. As the darkness consumed him, Nate saw fleeting images of others, musicians who had stolen Borrowed Light before him. Their forms crumbled into ash, their faces frozen in silent screams. "You borrowed my light," the performer whispered, his face now a mass of shifting darkness. "Now you'll walk in my shadow." Nate wanders now, a shadow of what he once was. He feels fragments of Borrowed Light flicker through him, tantalizingly close, but forever out of reach. Sometimes he's drawn to other struggling musicians, watching from the darkness as they edge closer to the same trap. He tries to warn them, but no sound comes. And always, he hears the refrain. "What glows will fade. What's taken, lost. Borrowed light demands its cost."